The last $20 Jeremiah Redmond possessed in this world were pressed into the weathered palm of a ferry operator on the Missouri River, and he did not once look away from the woman who needed them. She stood at the edge of the dock with her carpetbag clutched against her chest, her dark hair escaping its pins in the hot June wind, and her eyes were the color of river water in late afternoon, that impossible shade between green and gray that made a man forget entirely what he had been about to say. She had been arguing with the ferry operator, a thick-necked man named Holt, for the better part of 10 minutes, and her voice had gone from polite to desperate in a way that Jeremiah recognized with his whole chest, because he knew what desperation sounded like. He had lived inside it for 6 years. "I have told you," she said, her chin lifted even as her voice cracked at the edges, "that I will pay you when I reach the other side. My employer in Clarksdale is expecting me. I have a letter of arrangement right here. Letters don't float a ferry," Holt said flatly, already turning away. "You got the $1.50 or you wait for someone charitable." Charitable. Jeremiah almost laughed. There was a warrant for his arrest in 3 territories. He had 6 bullets in his revolver and a reputation that made sheriffs nervous and mothers pull their children indoors. He was not, by any reasonable measure, the sort of man who ought to be described as charitable. He stepped forward anyway. He did not think about it. He did not calculate the odds or weigh the cost or remind himself that $20 was all that stood between him and starvation for the next 2 weeks, that he had no job, no prospects, no name worth saying aloud in polite company. He simply moved, the way a man moves toward something his body has already decided belongs to him, and he counted out the bills from the fold tucked inside his coat and placed them in Holt's hand. "Her crossing," Jeremiah said quietly, "and $1.50 for myself." Holt counted the money with the slow deliberateness of a man who enjoyed holding other people's fates in his fingers. Then he stepped aside. The woman turned to look at Jeremiah Redmond, and it was the kind of looking that went all the way through a person, that stripped away the weathered coat and the gun on his hip, and the shadow under his eyes that came from too many nights sleeping light and too many mornings running. "You did not have to do that," she said. "No," he agreed. A pause settled between them long enough to mean something. "What is your name?" she asked. He hesitated because his name was a dangerous thing to give to a stranger, especially one with eyes that would remember it forever. He could feel that much about her already. She was the kind of woman who remembered things. "Jeremiah Redmond," he said. She looked at him for another moment, memorizing him, and the certainty of it moved through him like a cold current. "Minnie Mercer," she said, "and I will not forget what you did." The ferry moved. The Missouri River opened wide and brown and indifferent around them, carrying them both toward the far shore, and Jeremiah Redmond, who had not had a reason to hope for anything in a very long time, stood at the railing and tried not to look at her too much. He failed completely. To understand why that moment on the ferry dock mattered so much, to understand why those $20 and that name exchanged in the June heat would eventually reshape 2 broken lives into something whole and lasting, you have to go back to the weeks before it happened, to the separate paths that a woman named Minnie Mercer and a man named Jeremiah Redmond had been walking, neither of them knowing they were walking toward each other. Minnie Mercer was 24 years old in the summer of 1878, and she had been independent for exactly 7 months, which was not very long at all, and yet felt to her like a kind of hard-won freedom. She would sooner die than surrender. She had grown up in St. Louis, the 3rd daughter of a printer named Harold Mercer, who had strong opinions about books and very weak opinions about money management, which meant the Mercer household had always been rich in conversation and thin in actual resources. When Harold Mercer died of a fever in November of 1877, he left behind a wife, 3 daughters, 1 printing press, and debts that had been concealed from the family with the dedication of a man who believed things had a way of working out. They did not work out. Minnie's two older sisters, Clara and Ruth, had both married by then, and their husbands, decent men of varying degrees of warmth, absorbed their wives' portions of the debt and closed their doors, not unkindly, to any further obligation. Minnie's mother, Minnie Mercer, a woman whose greatest talent had always been a kind of beautiful, willful fragility, took to her bed with a grief that showed no sign of lifting, and the task of managing what remained of the household fell entirely to Minnie. She was good at managing. She had always been good at it. She kept accounts with the precision of a man twice her age, and she had read every book in her father's collection, and she possessed a stubbornness that people who liked her called determination, and people who did not like her called excessive. She sold the printing press. She settled what debts she could. She answered 3 advertisements in the newspaper before she found one that offered something genuine, a housekeeping and teaching position in a town called Clarksdale, on the far side of the Missouri River, in a household that needed a woman of education and capability. The arrangement had been made by letter with a man named George Tillman, who was a widower with 2 young sons, and who had written, with some formality, that he required a person of good character to manage the household and instruct the boys in their letters and arithmetic. The pay was fair by frontier standards. The position included room and board. Minnie had written back with the same formality, accepted the terms, packed her carpetbag, and told her mother, who was capable of listening to things even from her bed, that she was going to Clarksdale and would send money when she could. The journey from St. Louis to the Missouri River crossing had cost her almost everything she had brought. A broken axle on the stage had required an unplanned overnight stop at an inn that charged more than it should have. A theft at the way station, someone's quick hands in the chaos of passengers unloading, had taken the small folded envelope of extra cash she had kept in her outer coat pocket. By the time she reached the ferry dock at a place called Haverston's Crossing, she had exactly $1.03 to her name, and the crossing cost $1.50. She had argued with Holt for 10 minutes because she had nowhere else to go. Going back was not a possibility she was willing to entertain. Clarksdale was on the other side of that river, and her whole future was in Clarksdale, thin and uncertain as it was, and she was not going to surrender it because of 47 cents. And then Jeremiah Redmond had stepped forward. Jeremiah Redmond's path to that ferry dock was considerably more crooked than Minnie's, and considerably more dangerous, and it had begun not 7 months ago but 6 years ago, on a night in 1872 when he had been 22 years old and had made a choice that could not be unmade. He had grown up in Abilene, the son of a cattleman named Thomas Redmond, who had built his herd through years of hard work and had managed to hold onto about half of what he built, which was better than most. Jeremiah had worked cattle from the time he could ride, had learned the trails and the seasons and the particular politics of rangeland, and he had expected to spend his life doing exactly that. He was not unhappy with the expectation. He liked the work. He liked the honesty of it, the clean exchange of effort and result. Then his father's neighbor, a man named Victor Cross, had decided he wanted the Redmond land. Victor Cross was not the kind of man who asked for things directly. He was the kind of man who worked through lawyers and whiskey and quiet threats and carefully arranged debts. And by the spring of 1872, he had worked his way into a position where he could claim the Redmond Ranch on a technical default of a loan that Thomas Redmond had signed in a moment of vulnerability, not fully understanding the terms. Thomas Redmond was not a stupid man, but he had trusted Cross, which amounted to the same thing in the end. When Cross's men came to take possession of the property, they came with legal papers and with guns, which was the way of such things in that place and time. There was a confrontation. In the confusion, Thomas Redmond was shot. He survived barely and spent the rest of his shortened life with a wound that never fully healed. But in the moment of the shooting, Jeremiah had drawn his own gun and fired back, and one of Cross's hired men had gone down. The man did not die, but he had been shot by Jeremiah Redmond, and Victor Cross was the kind of man who had relationships with local law, and within a week, there was a warrant for Jeremiah's arrest for assault with intent to do bodily harm, which was a creative interpretation of what had actually happened. But interpretation was cheaper than truth when you had the right friends. Jeremiah's father, recovering slowly in a neighbor's house, had told him to run, so he ran. 6 years of running had made him lean and careful and very quiet. He had worked as a drover, a trail hand, a ranch hand, a stable hand, whatever work a man with his face and skill could find without providing too many references. He had avoided the larger towns and the more ambitious sheriffs. He had built up money and lost it and built it up again. He had been lonely in the way that a man gets lonely when loneliness has been his daily companion long enough that it stops feeling like an absence and starts feeling like a feature of the landscape. In the summer of 1878, he had been riding south out of Nebraska, following a vague lead about a cattle operation in Kansas that was hiring without asking too many questions, when his horse had thrown a shoe in a stretch of bad road, laming herself just enough to require a layover. The nearest settlement had been Haverston's Crossing, and it was there that he had spent his last significant money on the horse's care and a few nights at the cheapest boarding house. And it was there, at the Ferry dock, that he had seen Minnie Mercer arguing with a man twice her size over 47 cents. He had not meant to fall in love with her on the ferry. He had told himself, as the boat moved across the brown water and the June sun heated the planking under his boots, that he was simply a man who had done a decent thing, that he owed her nothing more and she owed him nothing more, and they would reach the other shore and go their separate ways, and that would be the end of it. Minnie Mercer was standing at the railing 6 feet from him, watching the far bank approach, and the wind off the river was moving her hair in a way that made his hands feel useless and large. "Where are you headed?" he asked, because silence was becoming uncomfortable and he had never been good at enduring discomfort without doing something about it. She turned to look at him, and again there was that quality in her gaze, that completeness, as if she were actually seeing him rather than the surface of him. "Clarksdale," she said, "there is a household position waiting for me, a widower with 2 boys, you." "South," he said, which was true in the way that most of his answers were true, incomplete but not dishonest. She nodded. "That is not very specific." "No," the corner of her mouth moved. It was not quite a smile, but it was the territory adjacent to one. "You paid my crossing fare, and you are riding toward something called South with $20 less than you had an hour ago." That seems like a man who had plans that did not account for unexpected charity. "I had plans," he said. "They adjusted." "I will pay you back," she said immediately, the words coming with a force that told him it was a matter of importance to her, not a social nicety. "As soon as I reach Clarksdale and draw my first wages, I will find a way to send the money. If you give me an address—" "There is no address," he said. She looked at him steadily. "Then I am in your debt with no way to clear it, which is an uncomfortable position." "I do not think of it as a debt," Jeremiah said. "I do," said Minnie. The ferry bumped against the far dock, and the spell of the river crossing broke into the ordinary business of passengers gathering their things, and the ferry operator calling out about the next departure. Jeremiah collected his horse from where she was tied at the side of the craft, and Minnie collected her carpet-bag, and they walked off the ferry together without having decided to walk together, which was a thing that happened sometimes between 2 people when something invisible and considerable had already been established between them. On the dock, a man was waiting with a wagon and a sign that said Clarksdale in letters that had been rained on at least twice. He was not George Tillman. He introduced himself as Tom, the Tillman hired hand, sent to collect the household woman from St. Louis. He had the manner of a man who had been told to bring back a package and was mildly surprised the package had a face. Minnie turned to Jeremiah on the dock, and for a moment neither of them spoke, because the moment required something and neither of them quite knew the form of it. "Thank you," she said. "Again, I mean it in a way that words are not quite adequate for." "I know," he said. "Jeremiah Redmond," she said, saying his name deliberately as if she were filing it somewhere very specific inside herself. "Minnie Mercer," he said. She held his gaze for one more long second, and then she took her carpetbag and climbed up onto the wagon seat beside Tom, and the wagon rolled away down the road toward Clarksdale, and Jeremiah stood on the dock and watched it go until the dust it raised had settled back into the road. His horse nudged his shoulder. "I know," he told the horse. "I know." He stood there another minute, and then he walked into the town of Haverston's Crossing to find out if there was any work available for a man who had just given away his last $20 and was starting, for the first time in a very long while, to feel something other than the particular gray weight of a life lived purely in avoidance. Clarksdale was 12 miles from the ferry crossing, and the Tillman house was another mile beyond the town itself, a solid two-story structure that had clearly been built with ambition and maintained with slightly less of it. The yard was clean enough, but the window boxes were empty, and the front porch needed paint, and Minnie observed all of this with the professional eye of a woman who had come to restore order to a place that had been losing it gradually. George Tillman met her at the door. He was perhaps 40, with a neat beard going gray at the edges, and the look of a man who had once been more energetic and was working to remember how. He was courteous in a formal, slightly stiff way, and he showed her the house with the careful pride of a man who knows it is not quite adequate but wants credit for trying. The two boys were named William, who was 7, and Samuel, who was 5. They regarded Minnie from behind their father with the complete wariness of children who have learned that new things in the household often mean change, and change had not recently been their friend. Minnie crouched down to their level, which was not what they expected, and she asked William what he knew about fractions and asked Samuel what his favorite animal was, and by the time she stood up again, the wariness had shifted at least partially toward curiosity. She unpacked her carpetbag in the small room at the back of the second floor, which had a window that looked out over the yard and a field beyond it that went gold in the late afternoon light. She hung her 2 dresses. She set her father's copy of Dickens on the small table beside the bed. She arranged her small jar of hairpins, and she sat down on the edge of the bed and pressed her hands flat against her knees and let herself feel, for just a moment, all of the accumulated exhaustion and relief and strangeness of the day. She thought about Jeremiah Redmond standing on the dock and watching her go. She had noticed things about him that she had not mentioned, because there was no reason to mention them, and because she was not certain she fully understood what she had noticed. She had noticed that he carried himself with the extreme alertness of a man who had learned to read rooms the way other people read weather. She had noticed that he had hesitated before giving his name, and that the hesitation was not shyness but something else, something more like the consideration a person gives to a gift they are not certain they should give. She had noticed that his coat, though worn, had once been a good coat, the kind a man buys with the intention of permanence. She had also noticed his eyes, which were dark and direct and held within them the particular quality of a man who had seen enough of the world's harder things to have stopped being surprised by them, and yet had not hardened all the way through. There was still something soft at the center of him, protected carefully, but present. She was a practical woman. She was in Clarksdale to work and to earn money and to send some of it home to her mother, and to build something stable in a life that had not been stable for a while. She was not in Clarksdale to think about men she had met on ferry docks. But she thought about him anyway, falling asleep that first night with the scent of the Missouri River still faintly in her hair, and his name arranged precisely in her memory, 2 syllables. Then one, Jeremiah Redmond, like the beginning of a sentence that had not yet found its end. In Haverston's Crossing, Jeremiah found work within the day, which he took as a sign that the world was not entirely against him, though he had learned not to read too much into such signs. A freighting company called Marsh & Sons was looking for a man to help with a supply run down to a string of small towns, 3 days' work, $4 a day plus food. He took it without negotiating, which was not his usual approach, but he was starting from nothing and could not afford principles about wages. The work was straightforward, loading and driving and unloading, the physical labor that his body was well adapted to after years of ranch and trail work. He shared the wagon with a man named Colby, who talked constantly and required very little in the way of response, which suited Jeremiah fine. He watched the landscape and kept his own counsel, and did not mention his name to anyone who did not specifically require it. At night, in the temporary quiet of a bedroll under a wagon or a bunk in a way station, he thought about the woman on the ferry dock with a thoroughness that surprised him. He was not a man who thought about women as a general practice. His life had not made room for it, but Minnie Mercer had taken up residence in his thinking in a way that had nothing to do with permission, and she seemed to have no interest in leaving. He thought about her voice, which was clear and precise, and had that particular quality of a person who has spent a lot of time reading, a certain exactness with words. He thought about the way she had said his name after he said hers, deliberately, as if sealing something. He thought about the 47 cents and the spine of her, the refusal to yield even in a situation where yielding seemed like the only option. He told himself it was nothing. He told himself a lot of things on those 3 nights under the wagon and the stars. On the 4th day, when the freight run was finished and he had $12 in his pocket and his horse was rested and sound again, he found himself looking at a map tacked to the wall of the freight company's office, and he found Clarksdale on it without intending to look for it, and it was 12 miles from Haverston's Crossing, which was not very far at all. He stood there looking at the map for a long time. He had no reason to go to Clarksdale. He had a vague plan about work in Kansas, and a more concrete need to stay off the main roads and out of situations where his name might connect to the warrant that was presumably still active in 3 territories, though he had never been certain exactly how actively it was being pursued after 6 years. Victor Cross had gotten the land he wanted, and the law had long memories but also limited resources, and a man who kept quiet and kept moving was often forgotten eventually. He had no reason to go to Clarksdale. He went to Clarksdale. He told himself he was just riding through. He told himself he was curious about the town. He told himself a lot of things that had the structural form of reasons without quite achieving the substance. Clarksdale was a working town, not large but not dying, with the mixture of ambition and wear that characterized settlements that had survived their first decade. There was a main street with a general store, a hardware and feed store, a bank, a telegraph office, a barber, 2 saloons, a church, and a small hotel that also served as a boarding house. The surrounding country was good farming and grazing land, and the people had the look of individuals who were building something and expected to be building it for a while. Jeremiah rode in on a Tuesday afternoon and stopped at the general store to buy some provisions, because that was a legitimate reason to be in a town, and he had learned to always have a legitimate reason. The woman behind the counter was perhaps 50, with the efficient kindness of a person who had served the community long enough to know everyone and everything about them. Passing through, she asked, which was the standard assessment question for strangers. "Looking for work," he said, which was true enough. "Tillman's spread might need a hand," she said. "George Tillman's been running short-staffed since his wife passed. Got a new household woman just arrived from St. Louis, so at least the house end of things will be sorted, but the working end of the ranch is thin." Jeremiah kept his face entirely neutral. "Where is the Tillman spread?" "Mile east, past the stand of cottonwoods on the right-hand side." He thanked her and bought his provisions and stood outside the store in the afternoon sun and had a direct conversation with himself about what he was doing and what he was about to do and whether they were the same thing or very different things. They were, he concluded, very different things. He rode east anyway. The Tillman spread looked better as he approached than it had sounded. The land was good land, and there was a substantial barn and several outbuildings, and the cattle he could see in the near field were in decent condition. What the place lacked, he could see immediately, was sufficient labor. The fencing on the north side wanted mending. The yard had that slightly overgrown look that came from too few hands and too much to do. He had not intended to stop at the house. He had intended, in some version of his plan that had clearly not survived contact with reality, to simply ride by and perhaps glimpse the woman from the ferry and establish for himself that she was fine and settled, and had not been on his conscience for nothing. Minnie Mercer was in the yard hanging washing on a line. She saw him at the same moment he saw her, and there was a mutual stillness. Two people stopped by the same surprise, and then she smiled, and it was the first time he had seen her smile, a real one, not the territory adjacent to a smile but the actual thing, and it went through him like the river had, except warmer. "Jeremiah Redmond," she said. "Minnie Mercer," he said. "You said you were riding south." "South is a large direction," he said. "Clarksdale is in it somewhere." She put down the shirt she had been holding and walked toward the fence that separated the yard from the approach road, and she looked up at him on his horse with an expression that mixed genuine pleasure with the particular assessment of a woman who does not miss much. "Are you looking for work?" she asked. "I am." "George Tillman needs ranch hands," she said. "Good ones who stay. He has had trouble keeping men this past year." "I might be able to stay for a while," Jeremiah said. The word "while" was doing a great deal of work in that sentence, carrying weight it had not been designed for, because what he meant by "while" was something considerably more open-ended than the word suggested, something that was trying, carefully, not to frighten either of them. Minnie seemed to understand the weight of it. She held his gaze for a moment. "I will tell him you are here." George Tillman was a practical man who needed labor more than he needed extensive references. And Jeremiah had the manner and the hands of someone who knew ranching from the ground up. The interview was brief and direct, and by the end of it Jeremiah had a place to sleep in the bunkhouse, which currently contained only one other man, a taciturn older hand named Wallace who minded his own business with devotion, and a wage of $30 a month plus food, which was adequate. He settled in. He had not in 6 years of moving settled anywhere. It felt strange, the way any unfamiliar thing feels strange, with an edge of both discomfort and relief. He worked hard because he always worked hard, and he kept his head down and his manner neutral and tried not to stare at Minnie Mercer every time he saw her, which was approximately 3 times a day. Morning, when she brought coffee and biscuits to the bunkhouse. Midday, when she brought a hot dinner out to whoever was working the near fields. And evening, when the household and working ends of the ranch intersected briefly at the water pump or the barn or the yard. He did not stare. He looked. There was a distinction that mattered to him even if no one else would have seen it. Minnie, for her part, was finding Clarksdale more complicated than her letters with George Tillman had suggested. The position was real and the pay was real, and the boys, William and Samuel, were bright and responsive, and she was already genuinely fond of them in the uncomplicated way you become fond of children who try hard and need someone to notice. But George Tillman himself was complicated. He was not unkind, but he was lonely in a way that had begun, in the 2 weeks since her arrival, to express itself as a kind of proprietariness that made her careful. He watched her in a way that was slightly different from how an employer watches an employee, and twice he had come into the kitchen in the evening when the work was done and the boys were in bed, and he had sat at the table with his coffee and talked to her in a way that was searching for something she was not prepared to offer. She did not know what to do about it yet. She needed the position. She had sent the first small portion of her wages home to her mother. She could not afford to misread the situation and cause a problem where there was not one, and she also could not afford to ignore a situation that was developing into one. The arrival of Jeremiah Redmond was, in ways she did not examine too closely, a comfort she had not expected. He was there. That was enough for now. He was there and he was solid, and she could see him through the kitchen window in the mornings, working the fence or the stock with the concentrated efficiency of someone who is good at what they do and does not need to advertise it. He was a presence she had catalogued as reliable, which was a word she did not give easily. They began to talk. It happened the way things happen when two people are in proximity, and are each more intelligent than average and more interesting to each other than either is quite comfortable admitting. It began with practical things, the state of the north fence, the temperament of a particular horse in the barn, the reading schedule she had established for William, who was sharper than the school books she had found could adequately challenge. It moved over days and then weeks into less practical things. She told him about her father's printing press and the books she had grown up with. He told her about the cattle trails, about the specific geography of the Kishom, about the way the sky looked over the Kansas plains at the end of a long drive. She asked him questions with the genuine curiosity of a person who actually wants to know the answer, and he found himself answering more fully than he had answered anything in years, found himself talking, and then, with a shock that was almost physical, realized that he had been talking for 20 minutes and had not once thought about whether he was saying too much. She noticed everything. He had known that about her from the ferry, but it became clearer as the weeks accumulated. She noticed when Wallace had a bad knee and quietly made sure his dinner was brought to him, rather than requiring him to walk to the house for it. She noticed when William was struggling with a concept and invented a new way to approach it, not the way the book suggested, but the way that particular boy's mind worked. She noticed when George Tillman was in one of his darker moods and adjusted the household accordingly, with a diplomatic skill that was impressive to watch. And she noticed Jeremiah. "You watch the road," she said to him one evening in late July, when they had found themselves at the water pump at the same time, and the late light was doing complicated things to the landscape. "Every time you hear a horse coming down the approach, you look up before you can stop yourself." He said nothing for a moment. "An old habit," he said carefully. "The kind of habit a man develops," she said, not looking at him, filling the water bucket with her eyes on the pump, "when he has reasons to be careful about who might be coming." He was quiet. "I am not asking," she said. "I want to be clear about that. I am not asking you to explain yourself to me. I am telling you that I have noticed and that it does not change anything I think about you." He looked at her profile in the fading light, the line of her jaw and the way she held her shoulders, and he felt something inside him go very still. "My name is on a warrant," he said, "in 3 territories. It has been for 6 years. She looked up then. Her expression was thoughtful, not alarmed. "What did you do?" she asked. "I shot a man who had just shot my father and was in the process of stealing our land with forged debt papers and corrupt law," he said. "The man lived. My father lost the land anyway. But Victor Cross had the connections to make the warrant happen, and I ran because I was 22 and afraid and did not know yet how to fight something that was not a gun." She was quiet for a long moment, the kind of quiet that was thinking rather than judging. "Victor Cross," she said. "Is he still in Abilene?" "Last I heard, still on the land that was my father's." "My father died in 1875 in a neighbor's house, never having returned to his own land." "I am sorry," she said, and she said it in the way she said everything, directly and without ornamentation, which made it feel like more than condolence. "The warrant," he said. "If you think it puts this household in danger, or if you think Tillman needs to know, I will not say anything," she said immediately. "It is not my information to give." But Jeremiah, she stopped, and the use of his first name without the last name was new, and they both felt the difference of it. "You cannot run forever. I know. There may be ways," she said, "to address what happened legally. It has been 6 years. The law has limits on how actively it pursues old warrants, especially when the original complaint was corrupt." "You know about law," he said, surprised. "My father had legal texts as well as novels," she said. "I told you he had opinions about books." He found himself smiling, which was something his face did rarely enough that it felt slightly unfamiliar. "Your father sounds like he was an interesting man." "He was a wonderful man who was terrible with money," she said, and she smiled too, and it was the smile he had been cataloging, the real one, and it was something he was not going to be able to walk away from. He understood that with clarity in the evening light by the water pump on the Tillman ranch. 2 months after he had given his last $20 to a ferry operator and changed both their lives. August arrived, and with it a heat that pressed down on the land like a hand, and several things happened in close succession that forced what had been growing slowly between them into a different and more urgent shape. The first thing was a letter. Minnie received it on a Wednesday, brought from town by Tom the hired hand, along with the general supply run. It was from her sister Clara, and it contained information that had clearly been written with some anxiety, because Clara's normally neat hand was uneven. Their mother had taken a serious turn. The doctor had been called. The situation was not immediately critical but was also not good. Clara thought Minnie should know. Minnie read the letter twice in the kitchen, then folded it very precisely and put it in her apron pocket and went back to making dinner because there was nothing else to do. She could not go back to St. Louis. She had not saved enough yet for the stage fare, and even if she had, she could not abandon her position after only 2 months without losing the reference and the wages both. She sent a reply letter with Tom the next day, asking for updates, and then she carried the worry with the competent silence of a woman who has learned that falling apart solves very few practical problems. Jeremiah saw her carrying it. He did not ask directly, because he recognized a privacy she needed, but 2 days after the letter, he found a moment when they were both in the barn without anyone else around, and he said, "If you need anything, I have wages coming at the end of the month and they are yours if they are useful." She looked at him with an expression that went to several complicated places very quickly, and then she said, "You gave me your last $20 4 months ago." 3 months, he said. 3 months ago, you gave me your last $20 with no expectation of return and no guarantee of ever seeing me again. You cannot make a habit of this. I can make whatever habits I choose, he said, which was not the most elegant thing he had ever said but was honest. She looked at him for a long moment, and something in her face moved in a way that told him she was deciding something, not about money but about something else entirely. She will be all right, Minnie said finally, about her mother, and he understood she was both telling him information and choosing to share it with him, which was a different and more significant thing. She is stronger than she presents herself. She has to be, she always has been. You are worried anyway, he said. Of course I am worried, she is my mother, he nodded. And then, because it was the right thing, and because he had not done enough right things in his life to let one pass when it presented itself, he said, "Tell me about her." So Minnie told him about Minnie Mercer, about the beautiful, willful fragility that was also a kind of armor, about the way she had read poetry aloud at the breakfast table and made every small occasion feel significant, about the debts she had not known about and the grief she had folded into herself after Harold died. And Jeremiah listened with his full attention, and it was one of those conversations that changes the internal geography of two people, rearranging what had been distant into something adjacent and then closer. The second thing that happened in August was George Tillman. On a Sunday evening, when the boys were in bed and Jeremiah and Wallace had gone to the bunkhouse, George Tillman sat down across from Minnie at the kitchen table and said, without preamble, that he thought she should consider becoming the permanent mistress of his household, not as an employee but as his wife. Minnie was very still for a moment. George Tillman was not a cruel man. He was lonely and he was practical, and he was looking at her as if she were a solution to a problem, which was perhaps not the worst thing a man could offer a woman, depending on the woman's circumstances. He offered her security and standing and a place that was permanent, and he mentioned, with careful tact, that her current situation, a single woman alone in a position with limited prospects, was one that he could resolve entirely. Minnie heard him out completely, because she believed in hearing people out. Then she said, as clearly as she could without being unkind, that she was honored by his regard and that she had great respect for him as an employer, but that she did not have feelings for him of the kind that marriage required, and that she did not think it would be fair to either of them to enter such an arrangement on terms that were fundamentally unequal. She said it carefully and without apology, because both of those qualities were necessary. George Tillman received it with dignity. He nodded once slowly and said that he understood, and that her position in the household was unchanged, and that he would not raise the matter again. And he did not, which told Minnie something to his credit. But that evening, after he had gone upstairs, she sat alone in the kitchen for a long time, thinking about permanence and belonging, and the particular vulnerability of being a woman in 1878, with a mother who needed help, and a position that could always be taken away, and a heart that had already, quite against her most practical intentions, made several significant decisions about a man who had given her his last $20 and watched her leave from a ferry dock. She went to bed without resolving any of it, which was a thing she rarely permitted herself. In the morning she found Jeremiah at the fence on the north side, replacing posts with the focused intensity he brought to all his work. She did not mean to tell him about Tillman's proposal. It was not his business, and it was not a thing she needed to burden him with. She told him anyway. His hand stopped on the post. He did not say anything for a moment, and the silence had a quality in it she had not heard from him before, something taut and precise. "What did you tell him?" Jeremiah said. "No," she said. The silence shifted. "Because you don't care for him that way," Jeremiah said, not a question. "Because I do not care for him that way," she confirmed. And also because she stopped. "Because," he said. She looked at him directly, which was the only way she knew how to look at anyone. "Because I have not been able to stop thinking about a man who gave his last $20 to a woman he did not know on a ferry dock, and that seems to me like it probably means something, and I am not willing to dismiss it simply because it is inconvenient." Jeremiah put down the post driver. He turned and looked at her across the fence. The morning light was flat and honest, and there was nowhere to hide anything in it, which was perhaps why he said what he said. "I have been in love with you since the Missouri River," he said. "I have been trying not to be in love with you since the Missouri River, because I am a man with a warrant on his name and no land and no certain future, and you deserve considerably better than whatever uncertain thing I can offer. But I am failing at not being in love with you, and I thought you should know." She gripped the fence rail with both hands, not because she needed support, but because she needed something to do with the force of what she was feeling. "We should address the warrant," she said, practically. "As a first step." He stared at her. "You told me it has been 6 years," she said. "You told me the original complaint was based on corruption. I want to write to a lawyer in Abilene. I have my father's legal texts. I know enough to ask the right questions. The statute of limitations on assault charges in Kansas in 1872, the original complaint. We should look into what the territorial laws actually say." "Minnie," he said. "The man you shot lived," she said. "The circumstances were defensive. The original warrant was issued by a compromised law office. These are facts that have legal weight." "Minnie," he said again. "What?" "Are you addressing my legal situation instead of responding to what I just told you because you have feelings you need to organize first?" A pause. "Yes," she said. He climbed over the fence. It was 3 rails high, and he went over it in one smooth motion and landed on her side of it, which was a metaphor she was perfectly capable of recognizing, and which made something warm and considerable move through her. And then he was standing close enough that she could see the exact quality of his eyes in the morning light, that dark steadiness that had something soft at the center of it, and she said, "Jeremiah," and he said, "I know," and he kissed her. It was a careful kiss, the kind a person gives when they are aware of the weight of the moment and are not willing to be careless with it. It lasted long enough to mean something definitive, and when it was finished, they both stood very still for a moment, adjusting to the new shape of the world. "I care for you," she said, "considerably, in a way I have not cared for anyone before, which is alarming and also wonderful, and I want to be honest with you about it." "I appreciate honesty," he said. "I know you do. It is one of the things." "What are the things?" he asked with a seriousness that was also warm. "The way you watch the road," she said. "The way you listened when I told you about my mother, the $20. The fact that when William could not understand long division, you sat down with him for 45 minutes and worked it out using cattle numbers until it made sense. The fact that you are kind in ways you do not announce. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The way you held your chin up at the ferry dock when you were afraid." "I was terrified," she said. "I know. That made it more extraordinary, not less." They stood together by the north fence in the August morning, and it was one of those moments that is simple and enormous at the same time, the kind that a person comes back to in memory for years, not because anything dramatic happened, but because everything real happened. Then Minnie said, "We need to talk to a lawyer." They talked to a lawyer. This required careful planning and a trip to a larger town than Clarksdale, a town with a legal office that did not have connections to any of the territories where the warrant was filed. They chose a man named Albert Crane in the county seat, 20 miles to the west, a lawyer with a reputation for careful work and a practice that included a number of cases involving disputed land and corrupt frontier law. The meeting took 3 hours. Minnie brought her father's legal texts and the notes she had made, and she laid out the case with the organized precision she brought to everything. And Albert Crane listened with increasing attention. And at the end he said that there were indeed grounds to challenge the warrant, that the documented corruption of the law office that had issued it was a matter of record in the broader Kansas legal history, that the statute of limitations on the original charge had in fact expired under territorial law, and that the warrant was almost certainly no longer technically valid, though it would need to be formally vacated to protect Jeremiah entirely. This would take time. It would require correspondence with legal offices in 3 territories and potentially a hearing. But it was possible. It was more than possible. Jeremiah sat very still through most of this, in the way he sat still when something was happening that he had not expected, and that required him to recalibrate his understanding of what was available to him. He had spent 6 years believing the warrant was a permanent feature of his life, a wall he moved around rather than something that could be taken down, and the possibility that it could be taken down was something he had to approach slowly, the way you approach something you have stopped expecting and must be careful not to grab at too quickly. Minnie watched him during this and said nothing, because she understood he needed a moment with it. On the road back to Clarksdale, when the county seat was behind them and the afternoon light was long across the prairie, Jeremiah said, "I do not know what to do with the possibility of a legitimate future." "You learn it," she said. "You learn anything, incrementally and with more patience than it seems like it should require." He reached across the wagon seat and took her hand. She let him take it and pressed her fingers against his. "When the warrant is resolved," he said, "when it is formally vacated and my name is clear, I want to ask you something." "I already know what you want to ask," she said. "Do you know what your answer will be?" "Yes," she said. "Will you tell me?" "No," she said. "You have to ask it properly." He laughed, and it was the first full, unguarded laugh she had heard from him, and it changed his face entirely, opened it up like a door, and she stored it alongside the smile she had first seen in the yard, in the collection she was building of the real him, the one that existed underneath the careful quietness. The legal process took 5 months. Albert Crane was thorough and relentless, and Minnie wrote letters on Jeremiah's behalf that were models of clear legal reasoning, and George Tillman, who had learned of the situation and was a fair man despite the awkwardness between him and Minnie, provided a statement of character for Jeremiah as his employer that carried genuine weight. The land office in Abilene was contacted. The history of Victor Cross's activities was not, it turned out, unknown to legal authorities in Kansas, and the documented pattern of corrupt land seizures had already been under examination. The warrant against Jeremiah was officially vacated in February of 1879. The formal notice arrived by post, a single official document, brief and dry and entirely transformative. Jeremiah read it in the bunkhouse, sitting on the edge of his cot, and he stayed there for a long time with the document in his hands. Then he went to find Minnie. She was in the kitchen, and the boys were at their lessons in the front room, and the morning was quiet and winter pale through the windows. He came through the back door with the document in his hand, and she looked up from the bread she was making and she saw his face, and she did not need to read the document. She said his name. Just his name and all of it, Jeremiah Redmond, both syllables and then one, and she put down what she was doing and crossed the kitchen and put her flour-covered hands against his face, and he put his forehead against hers. "It is done," he said. "Yes," she said. "I have something to ask you." "I know." He pulled back far enough to look at her properly, and his dark eyes were very clear, all that careful protection around the soft center of him finally, after months and years, entirely unnecessary. He said, "Minnie Mercer, I would like you to be my wife. I am a man without land or significant resources, and with a history that has been complicated and a future that I cannot map with certainty. But I love you in a way that I think is the most honest thing I have ever been, and I would spend the rest of my life trying to deserve that." She said, "Yes, Jeremiah," and she said it with the directness and precision she brought to everything, no flourish required because the thing itself was enough. He kissed her in the kitchen with the winter light coming through the windows, and from the front room there was a small sound, and they both looked up to find William and Samuel standing in the doorway, wide-eyed and arrested mid-lesson. "Is Miss Mercer going to stay?" William asked. Jeremiah looked at Minnie. "She is." "Good," Samuel said, with the decisive approval of a 5-year-old who has considered the matter and reached a conclusion. The wedding was in March of 1879, in the Clarksdale church, which was small but sufficient. George Tillman gave Minnie his sincere good wishes, and he meant them. Wallace the ranch hand attended and wore a clean shirt, which was the most anyone could have asked. Albert Crane sent a letter of congratulation. Minnie wore a dress she had made from fabric she had chosen carefully from the general store, a deep blue that the woman behind the counter said matched her eyes, and Jeremiah wore the good coat that had once been a good coat, and that Minnie had spent an evening quietly repairing, so that it was a good coat again. They said their vows in front of the minister and the small gathered community, and Minnie Mercer became Minnie Redmond with the same clear directness with which she did everything. And Jeremiah said his vows with a solemnity that the minister would later describe as the most sincere he had witnessed in 20 years of performing marriages. The question of where to live and what to build their life on was not simple, but they had both learned that few worthwhile things were. Jeremiah had been corresponding with Albert Crane about the Abilene land, the land that had been his father's, the land that Victor Cross had seized through corrupt means. The investigation into Cross's activities had expanded in the months while the warrant was being vacated, and it turned out that the Redmond land was among several properties that had been fraudulently seized. The legal process was long and not guaranteed, but Crane thought there was a real possibility of restitution. In the meantime, George Tillman, who was finding his own way forward, and had recently begun a correspondence with a widow in the next county with promising indications on both sides, made Jeremiah a proposition. He needed a solid foreman. The ranch was growing, and he had children to think of, and he wanted a man he trusted to manage the working end of things. The position came with a proper wage and a small house on the western edge of the property, a house that had been used for storage but was structurally sound and could be made into a home. Jeremiah looked at Minnie. Minnie looked at the house. "It has good windows," she said, "and the south-facing room would be excellent for light." They took the position and they cleaned out the small house and rebuilt it together, because Jeremiah was good with his hands and Minnie was good with everything else. And by April the house had a proper kitchen and curtains she had sewn herself and a shelf for her father's books, and a table where 2 people could sit and eat together in the evening and talk about the day, which was, Minnie thought, one of the fundamental pleasures of a life well built. She wrote to her mother with the news of her marriage, a letter full of the kind of careful, genuine happiness that reads as credible precisely, because it is not overwritten. Minnie Mercer, whose health had stabilized over the winter months, wrote back with a length and warmth that suggested she had recovered more of herself than Minnie had hoped. She said she would like to visit when she was stronger, and Minnie wrote that the house had a spare room and she would be welcome whenever she was ready. The summer of 1879 was a good summer. Jeremiah ran the Tillman Ranch with the comprehensive competence of someone who had spent years learning every aspect of cattle work, and the operation expanded steadily. Minnie continued teaching William and Samuel, and William, who had long since outpaced the books she had brought, was now working through a borrowed algebra text, which was ambitious for a 9-year-old but which he was, with characteristic stubbornness, managing. George Tillman's correspondence with the widow in the next county progressed to a formal courtship, and the household had a different and easier feeling, the tension of an unanswered question resolved. In August, Minnie told Jeremiah she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen of the small house in the evening, with the lamp lit and the window open to the warm night, and she told him directly, which was the only way she knew how to tell things, and she watched his face carefully, the way she always watched his face when something significant was happening. What she saw was not fear or uncertainty or any of the complicated emotions she had been prepared for. What she saw was a man in the grip of something enormous that he did not have the vocabulary for, a happiness so large and unexpected that it had temporarily exceeded his capacity for expression. His eyes were very bright. He put his hands on either side of her face the way she had put hers on his when the warrant came, and he did not say anything for a long moment. Then he said, "Minnie," and she said, "I know," which had become between them a shorthand for the things that were too complete to require more words. He was careful with her in the way that a person is careful with something precious, not overprotective, because she would not have tolerated overprotection, but present. He was aware of what she needed before she asked for it, which she had always valued in him, that attentiveness that was quiet rather than performed. The boy was born in April of 1880, which was spring, which seemed right. He was delivered by the doctor from Clarksdale and by 2 neighbor women who knew what they were doing, and Jeremiah spent 5 hours outside the house doing things that did not need doing, because motion was the only thing he could manage. And when the neighbor woman opened the door and told him he could come in, he was inside in seconds. His son was very small and very loud and had a full head of dark hair and the most furious expression Jeremiah had ever seen on a person, which he felt was a promising beginning. "Thomas," Jeremiah said, looking at the boy in Minnie's arms, "after my father." Minnie, who was tired in the magnificent way of a woman who has accomplished something enormous, looked down at the baby and then up at her husband and said, "Thomas Redmond." "Yes, that is right." Thomas Redmond grew with the speed and enthusiasm that the frontier seemed to encourage in its children. He was walking by 11 months, which the neighbor women said was early, and talking by 14, which was also early, and he had his mother's directness and his father's attentiveness, and a character that was distinctly his own, definite and cheerful and impossible to redirect once he had decided on a course. In the autumn of 1880, a letter arrived from Albert Crane. The legal proceedings regarding the Abilene land had reached a conclusion. Victor Cross, who had been under increasing legal scrutiny for a pattern of fraudulent land seizures, had been required to surrender several properties as part of a settlement of the broader case. The Redmond land was among them. The legal title was being restored to the surviving heir, which was Jeremiah. Jeremiah read the letter sitting at the kitchen table with Thomas on his knee, the baby chewing on a biscuit with serious concentration, and he read it twice, and then he handed it to Minnie without a word. She read it. She put it down on the table. She looked at her husband. "Your father's land," she said. "Our land," he said. It was a month before they could go, because there was the ranch to consider and George Tillman's plans, and Thomas was not yet walking reliably, and the winter was coming, and practical things required practical attention. But in November, they loaded a wagon and rode to Abilene, and Albert Crane met them at the county records office, and Jeremiah Redmond signed the papers that restored his family's land to his possession. He stood on that land afterward with Minnie beside him and Thomas on his hip, and the Kansas sky was the color of pewter in November, and the wind was cold, and the land was empty of cattle, and the house that had been his father's had clearly been neglected by Cross's people, but the bones of it were good, and the fencing was repairable, and the land was the land. "It is going to require a great deal of work," Minnie said. "Yes," he said. "We will need help. We cannot run it alone." "No. George Tillman will need time to find a new foreman. He will manage. He has the widow now." George Tillman had, in fact, married his widow in September, a capable and warm woman named Helen who had taken to the boys with considerable enthusiasm, which had freed both the household and Minnie and Jeremiah's consciences considerably. "And my mother," Minnie said. "She has been speaking of the visit for 6 months. We could write to her. Tell her the new house will have a proper guest room." He turned to look at her, his wife, who had turned his last $20 into a future, who had taken a man running from his name and given that name back to him, piece by piece, through law and love, and the absolute refusal to consider any version of events where it did not come right. "You want to rebuild it here," he said. "I think it is the right thing," she said. "Your father's land, your son's inheritance, and I think," she paused, looking at the empty house with its good bones, "I think that place becomes a home the way anything becomes real, by being lived in." They moved to the Abilene property in the spring of 1881. Minnie Mercer came by stage from St. Louis in June, and she was not the fragile woman Minnie had feared for, but a woman who had done some rebuilding of her own in the past 3 years, who walked into the repaired house with the particular deliberate appreciation of someone who has been through enough to know value when they see it. She stayed for 2 months, and she and Jeremiah developed a relationship that was initially cautious on both sides and became, over the course of those months, genuinely warm. She read to Thomas in the evenings from Dickens, which was the same book that Minnie had brought in her carpetbag all the way from St. Louis, and Thomas, who was not yet able to understand most of it, sat with perfect attentiveness because he liked the sound of his grandmother's voice. The Redmond Ranch rebuilt itself over the following years the way good things rebuild, not dramatically but steadily, with the kind of growth that comes from consistent effort and sound judgment, and the particular advantage of 2 people who complement each other completely. Jeremiah built the cattle operation from the ground up, buying a small herd and expanding it with careful selection, and the knowledge of a man who had spent years doing this work. Minnie managed the household and the accounts, and, when the nearest school was proved inadequate, established a small schoolroom in the house that served Thomas and eventually the children of 2 neighboring families, because there were children who needed teaching, and she was a woman who taught things. William and Samuel Tillman rode over to visit sometimes, and William, at 14, was almost taller than Jeremiah and already thinking about what he would do when he was grown, and Minnie looked at him sometimes with the specific satisfaction of a person who has watched a mind develop and knows they had something to do with it. In 1883, their second child was born. Another boy, which William declared predictable and Samuel declared excellent. They named him Harold, for Minnie's father, and Harold came into the world with the same furious expression as Thomas and the same dark hair, and added his voice to the growing population of the Redmond household with apparent enthusiasm. Thomas, at 3, regarded his brother with a mixture of fascination and suspicion that was entirely appropriate and which resolved, over months, into a protective attachment that was touching to witness. He brought Harold things. Rocks primarily, and occasionally a stick, which were the gifts of a 3-year-old, and Harold received them all with the undiscriminating goodwill of an infant. The house expanded. Jeremiah added a wing on the east side with 2 more rooms, building it himself over the summer months in the evenings after the ranch work was done. And Minnie helped with the framing because she was capable of it, and because she said that a house you have built with your own hands is a house you understand differently. She was right about this, as she was right about most practical things. There was a night in the autumn of 1884 when Thomas was 4 and Harold was 1, and the house was quiet and the Kansas sky was enormous outside the bedroom window and the stars were very clear, when Jeremiah said, lying in the dark with his wife's head on his shoulder, "I think about the Ferry dock sometimes." "So do I," she said. "I think about what would have happened if I had ridden on, if I had not stopped." "You would not have ridden on," she said. "How do you know?" She was quiet for a moment. "Because you were not, at your core, a man who could ride past someone who needed help. The warrant and the running had not changed that. I could see it. From the ferry dock." From the ferry dock. He was quiet, thinking about this, about the version of himself that had stepped forward and given away his last $20 without thinking, about the version of Minnie Mercer who had memorized his name and carried it forward, about all the specific and unrepeatable chain of circumstances that had led to this room, this bed, this woman's head on his shoulder, and the sound of 2 small boys sleeping in the next rooms. "I used to believe," he said, "that my life was about surviving, just surviving, getting through the next day without the wrong person finding my name. And now I think it was always about getting to this," he said. "About finding something worth building and having the good sense to build it." She put her hand flat against his chest, over his heart. "That is a very romantic thing to say, for a man who spent 6 years being entirely practical." "You are a bad influence," he said. "I am an excellent influence," she said. "You have a deed in your name and a legal history and 2 sons and a cattle operation that turned a profit for the 3rd consecutive year. That is my influence." "Noted," he said. "And appreciated." "Good," she said. "Now go to sleep." He did. He slept the way he had not slept in the first years of his running, deeply and without the watchful part of his brain keeping guard, because there was nothing to guard against now, and the future was a thing he was building rather than a thing he was trying not to be caught by. In 1886, Albert Crane wrote with news that Victor Cross had been formally prosecuted for the broader pattern of land fraud and had been sentenced accordingly. The letter was brief and informational, and Jeremiah read it and thanked Crane by reply and set the letter in the box where he kept important documents and went back to work. Minnie watched him do this and said nothing, because she understood that some things are finished rather than resolved, and that the ending of a wrong is not always as large as the wrong itself was. What mattered was that it was finished. The boys grew. Thomas, at 6, had his mother's eyes and his father's hands and an interest in cattle that was entirely his own, following Jeremiah through the ranch work with the absorption of a child who is finding his vocation early. Harold, at 3, was a different character, more given to sitting and observing before acting, which made him seem almost unreasonably thoughtful for his age, and which Minnie said meant he was going to be either a lawyer or a philosopher, both of which she was prepared to support. In 1887, there was a drought. It was a hard year across much of Kansas, and the Redmond ranch took losses along with everyone else, cattle that could not be sustained through the dry summer, grass that did not come back fully. It tested them. It tested the operation and the finances and the particular endurance of people who have built something and must watch it take damage. Minnie managed the accounts through that year with a precision that minimized the damage as much as could be done, making decisions about what to sell and what to hold with the calm calculation of a person who does not panic and does not despair, who simply looks at what is in front of her and determines what can be done about it. Jeremiah made the operational decisions with the same quality, and they consulted each other on everything, because that was how they had always done it, the household and the ranch as connected parts of the same enterprise. No false division between what was her domain and what was his. They came through the drought leaner than they had been, but intact, and the following year, 1888, the rains returned and the grass came back, and the herd rebuilt. In the spring of 1889, Minnie told Jeremiah she was expecting again. She was 35 and he was 38, and this news came with more complexity than the previous two. A quiet conversation in the kitchen rather than a dramatic announcement, with more acknowledgement of the weight of it and also with the same fundamental gladness. The third child was a girl. She arrived in the deep winter of 1889, during a snow that kept the doctor on the road too long and required Jeremiah to serve functions he had not anticipated serving, with the neighbor woman who had been there for both Thomas and Harold guiding him through it with admirable competence and a total absence of alarm that he found deeply reassuring. The girl had her mother's dark hair and Jeremiah's dark eyes, which was a combination that promised to be considerable. Thomas, 9 years old and now fully established as the ranch's most devoted apprentice, regarded his sister with the complicated solemnity of someone who has been the eldest for a long time and understands that something significant has changed. Harold, at 6 and already demonstrating the contemplative character that Minnie had predicted, sat beside the bed where Minnie lay with the baby and asked several careful questions about what babies ate and how they breathed through their noses when they were sleeping. "Eleanor," Minnie said, when Jeremiah asked her what they should name the girl, "for my mother." Jeremiah held the baby, who had stopped crying and was now merely furious in the way of all Redmond children on their first day in the world, and he said, "Eleanor Redmond." "Yes." Eleanor Mercer, who was now 61 and living in the comfort of a small house in St. Louis that Minnie had arranged to be paid for from the ranch profits with a regularity that had become sufficient, received the letter with news of her namesake granddaughter, with what her neighbor later described as a weeping that lasted the better part of an afternoon, and was clearly the happy kind. She came to visit in the spring of 1890, which was not her first visit. She had come 3 times since the first summer, but it was the first where she stayed long enough that the word visit started to feel insufficient. She was older and slower than she had been, and the journey from St. Louis was harder, and Minnie watched her mother moving through the house with the children and thought about distance and time and what was practical. One evening, when the children were in bed and Jeremiah had come in from the last check of the animals, and the 3 of them were sitting in the front room with the lamp and a pot of tea, Minnie said to her mother, "You could stay." Eleanor Mercer looked at her daughter and then at her son-in-law. "Here, there is the room that is always ready for you," Minnie said, "and the children know you, and the journey grows harder, and I would rather," she stopped, "I would rather have you close." Eleanor looked at Jeremiah. He met her eyes. "We would both rather have you close," he said. She stayed. She did not leave after that. She was absorbed into the Redmond household with the natural ease of a woman who had always known how to make herself part of a thing, and she read Dickens to Eleanor the baby in the evenings, the way she had read Dickens to Thomas when he was barely able to sit still, and she taught Harold the poetry that she had always loved, and Harold, true to his nature, received it with an appreciation that made her openly delighted. The years of the late 1880s and early 1890s were years of building and settling, the kind of years that are not dramatic to describe but are rich to live, full of the small particular pleasures of a life that has found its shape. The ranch grew further. Jeremiah hired 2 more hands and expanded the herd, and the operation was recognized locally as one of the well-run spreads in the county, which was a reputation he wore quietly and Minnie wore with satisfaction. Thomas became, at 12 and then 14, indistinguishable from a young man, with his father's hands and his mother's precision, and a natural authority with the cattle that the ranch hands acknowledged without comment, because it was simply evident. Harold read everything he could access, and when the county established a proper school in 1892, he went to it and came back every afternoon with questions about everything he had been taught, wanting to take the lesson further, which Minnie found immensely gratifying and Jeremiah found both baffling and wonderful. Eleanor the girl was 4 when her grandmother, Eleanor the elder, became ill with something that the doctor called a weakness of the lungs. It was not rapid, but it was sure. And over the winter of 1893, Minnie sat with her mother through the evenings, and they talked in the way they had not always had time to talk when Minnie was young, and managing everything, and her mother was managing her own grief. They talked about Harold Mercer and the printing press and the books and the debts, and all the complicated inheritance of a family's particular history, and they talked about Clarksdale and the Ferry dock. And Minnie Mercer said, with the clarity of a woman who is running out of time for anything but honesty, "When you wrote to tell me you had married a man named Jeremiah Redmond, I prayed you had found something true." "I found something true," Minnie said. "I can see that," her mother said. "It is in the way he looks at you when he thinks you are not looking back." Minnie Mercer died in February of 1894, quietly, in the room that had been always ready for her, with Minnie holding her hand and the sound of the house around her, the children sleeping and the fire in the stove, and the particular settled silence of a home that has been lived in with love. Minnie grieved cleanly and completely, in the way she did all things, not suppressing it and not performing it. Jeremiah let her grieve and did not try to manage it, was simply present the way he was always present, that quality of steady, watchful care that was the most reliable thing she had ever known. By spring, the grief had changed its character from sharp to present, the way grief does when you are honest with it, and the household continued, because the household was something all of them were committed to continuing. In 1895, Thomas was 15 and already talking about what he wanted to do with the ranch when he was grown, which was not an abstract conversation, because his father was beginning to involve him in decisions in ways that were real rather than instructive. Harold, 13, had declared with complete seriousness that he intended to study law, which surprised no one who had watched him for the past decade. Minnie, 5, was a child of tremendous force of character, who had her mother's vocabulary and her father's stillness and her grandmother's love of reading, and who had already organized her two brothers into an educational relationship in which she demanded they teach her everything they knew, which Thomas found endearing and Harold found appropriate. Jeremiah and Minnie sat on the porch one evening in the summer of 1895, and the land stretched away from them in the long golden light of the Kansas evening, and the cattle were visible in the far field, and the sounds of the children could be heard from inside the house, Thomas explaining something to Minnie with patient repetition, and Harold's voice, correcting something Thomas said with the precise assurance of a 13-year-old who has read more about the subject. "Do you remember," Minnie said, "the Ferry dock? Every day," Jeremiah said, "I asked your name. You did. And you hesitated," she said, "because it was a dangerous name to give, or so you thought then." "It seemed dangerous at the time," he agreed. "And now it is carved on a deed and on a fence post and in 3 marriage documents and 2 birth records." She paused. "3 birth records." "3," he said. "Minnie Redmond." "Jeremiah Redmond," she said, saying his name the way she had said it on the Ferry dock in 1878, deliberately, with the quality of something being fixed in memory. Except that now it was 17 years later, and the name was not something being memorized for an uncertain future, but something that was already the whole shape of her life. He turned to look at her. She was 41 years old, and she was the most fully realized person he had ever known, and he was aware, with a gratitude that had not diminished with familiarity but had instead grown into something continuous and permanent, that he had not ridden on from that Ferry dock. "I am glad I stopped," he said. "I know," she said. He took her hand, and they sat together in the evening light of the ranch that had been his father's and was now theirs, with their children arguing cheerfully in the house behind them and the land going gold in front of them. And the sum of it was something that Jeremiah Redmond had not believed in for the 6 years he had been running, had barely remembered believing in, and which had turned out, against considerable odds, to be exactly what was waiting for him at the end of a ferry crossing, and a woman's willingness to remember his name. The stars came out over Kansas as the light went, one by one, and Minnie leaned her head against her husband's shoulder, and the sound of the children inside moved from argument to laughter, and somewhere in the field beyond the fence, a calf called for its mother and was answered. And the world was, in that moment, and in all the moments available to people willing to stop and give what they have to give, sufficient and complete.